I experienced this incident in 1997 while working as a security guard for a gated beach community in Massachusetts. It was the first weekend following Labor Day, and many business owners had already started or finished closing their doors for the year. Although there was still a regular trickle of renters, things were generally quiet at this time of year, and they would stay that way at least through September. The actual development surrounded a quarter-mile beachfront. In addition to a few avenues of connected townhouses and unattached homes, it was made up of 3 multi-story structures, with a few dozen condominium units in each. The majority of the adults would park themselves along the beach, while there were a few pools and other recreational places for the youngsters. The majority of the occupants were elderly couples and families, but there were a few groups of younger children that wandered the streets at different times of the day and night. These children ranged in age from 9 or 10 to early or middle age. You had a select group of younger tenants or residents who were more problematic than others. When quiet hours began at 11 p.m., anyone under the age of 18 was required to return to their apartments or homes. We tolerated the majority of the college students as long as they weren't too disruptive and were mostly searching for a place to drink or smoke. The majority of them had already gone back to school around this time of year, with the exception of those whose institutions were close by or who still lived close enough to visit on the weekends. There were only 3 of us working on a weekend night at around 1 in the morning. It was going to be a fairly quiet night, other from doing our routine rounds and requesting a small group of 20-somethings who were drinking by one of the pools to move to the beach. When the camera feed observing the north trail to the beach went dark, we were all gathered in the little gatehouse at the community's main entrance. I offered to look into the situation, so I borrowed one of the golf carts that we had available to us with the complex's maintenance crew. The beach was isolated from the complex's pools and residential area by a 4-acre-wide swath of trees and lush vegetation. This area of thicket was traversed by 3 trails, the north, center, and south trails, which led from the remainder of the complex to the shore. Given that it technically crossed a wildlife management area that bordered the complex, the North Trail was the longest and most isolated of the 3. The trip to the North Trail from the gatehouse took roughly 3 minutes. The complex's northeastern corner was where the trail began. Here, there was a resident parking lot, a row of storage sheds, and a small sitting area with some grills and a fire pit. I noticed that just 3 of the parking lot's 9 street lamps were on when I arrived, since it seemed darker than normal. As soon as I heard movement near a bench near the entrance to the North Trail, I was able to follow the trails of 2 teens as they fled into the wall of shadows that marked the boundary of the pathway. I shook my head and let out a small chuckle when I smelled marijuana in the breeze coming from the beach's direction. Most likely would have simply advised you to take it to the beach in any case, I murmured to myself as I made my way to the storage sheds. As I reached a panel board that was embedded in the white painted concrete wall separating the parking lot and the beginning of the underbrush, I looked back up at the street lamps and questioned whether the camera's feed going out was a symptom of a larger power-related problem. After a quick check, it was discovered that neither the streetlights nor the camera switch had been tampered with. I reset the power and after a couple of seconds flipped the switches for the streetlights and security camera back on. I was pleased to see that all 9 streetlights were once more lighted. I proudly surveyed the rest of the parking lot as I proudly collected my radio, grinning smugly at my success. How does the feed appear right now? I questioned the other 2 gatehouse security personnel. Our manager, Bill, responded in a static-filled, crackly voice. Still nothing, Tex. Get on a bus and go to the platform. Check to see whether the camera is defective in any way. On the real camera there should be a button or some other method for manually resetting it. We'll have maintenance have a look at it in the morning if it doesn't work. I answered, I'll radio you when I'm there, and let out a long, huffy sigh. I closed the panel board, reattached my radio to its belt clip, and climbed back onto the golf cart. I've traveled alone along the north route at night before, and I must confess, it's quite unsettling. I restarted the golf cart and began traveling down the wooden path. Up until you arrived at the wooden platforms on the shore, none of the 3 pathways had any lights. I had to rely solely on the golf cart's headlights for illumination as it quickly grew dark. I anticipated there would be other people at the station when I arrived after seeing those 2 stoners run off down the route and recalling the group of children we told to go to the beach. Given that it was less frequently utilized and was located in a more remote area of the complex, the North Trail was a well-liked place for smoking and drinking. I was thinking about these things while I was rolling down the trail. I felt the radio clip on my belt shift, so I looked down to adjust it while using my other hand to steer the golf cart around a bend in the pathway. My eyes widened as I turned around and slammed on the brakes to bring the golf cart to an abrupt but violent halt. A young woman in a white camisole dress was standing in the middle of the trail. The first thing I saw was the light brown sand and mud stains on her dress. She had two huge, sunken green eyes that were ringed by slightly darker rings, and her complexion was very pale. She had jagged, ragged-looking dark brown hair that was done up in a bun with bits of sand and mud tangled in it. She was barefoot, appeared to be in a stupor, and had very frail-looking limbs. She couldn't have been more than 15 or 16. I knew she had to have been under the influence of alcohol or a narcotic right quickly. I sat back down in the driver's seat and inhaled slowly and deeply while I waited for the female to move. She initially did nothing but stared straight ahead. She appeared to be looking directly at me, but I immediately realized that she was actually looking off into space and was unconcerned by my startling presence. After a few brief moments of stillness, I finally muttered, "Sorry, I didn't notice you there. Do you have your house band with you?" Residents and tenants wore residence bracelets on their wrists to show that they were lodging at the facility. I glanced swiftly over the girl's wrists and ankles before she could reply, but I couldn't see her wearing one. However, since it was out of peak season, we were quite slack on this regulation, so I chose to ignore it. The girl remained silent and had a somber expression on her face, as if something troubling had taken over her line of thought. "Are you a local?" Then I inquired, which apparently elicited a response from her since the girl's eyes suddenly came back to life and she slightly turned to face me. She shook her head vertically without saying anything. As I looked at the girl again, I trembled to think of how seriously damaged she must have been. Though a part of me wanted to go back behind the wheel, I couldn't help but feel terrible for her because I knew something distressing had occurred to her tonight. "Please drive me home." I jumped a little at the girl's surprised question. There were 2 rows of back seats in the golf cart. Although it was against the law, we frequently made exceptions for the neighborhood's elderly people and the occasional drunken person who needed help getting back home. Although I could tell there was something strange about this girl, I couldn't help but sternly nod my head as if she could take a trip with me. "You don't mind tagging along for the ride? I simply need to make a quick stop at the platform and can then take you back," I murmured to the girl as she made her way cautiously to the golf cart and stepped inside. "How is your unit doing?" "It's not that far." The girl hung her head as if she were looking down at her feet as she softly whimpered in a melancholy tone. "Is anyone now seated on the platform?" I questioned as I started driving again, moving more slowly than before in case I ran into anyone else coming back from the beach. The girl continued to droop her head and made no comment. I pursed my lips, reasoning that she must not have been in the mood to talk much, and I continued to focus on the route. The drive seemed to be taking forever because of my slow speed and the mounting anxiety coming from the weird female seated behind me. I had traveled about 3/4 of the distance and was now on the pathway's more private stretch, which briefly passed through the wildlife management area. When the girl's voice burst out and broke the enveloping calm of our voyage, I caught my first glances of the platform's lights. "Stop." I abruptly stopped the golf cart in response to the girl's urgent, strong demand. "What is the issue?" I queried the girl, who initially remained silent before gently raising her left arm to indicate in the direction of the trees. "I am present." The girl got out of the golf cart, walked off the path, and into the brush before I had a chance to react. "Where are you heading, exactly?" I inquired, partially stepping out of the golf cart as the girl began casually strolling toward the bush. I was slightly concerned and perplexed. The girl stopped, didn't turn, and kept looking forward. "It's all right. Walter will be there soon." She spoke in the same depressingly humble tone with a glimmer of hope. I was perplexed by her remark and took a time to consider my next move. The girl kept moving into the trees and bushes. I swiftly leapt out of the golf cart, caught up to her in a few lunge-like strides, and put my hand on her shoulder because I knew I couldn't let her leave by herself. "Can you please wait a moment?" My hold on her shoulder became more firm as I stumbled, and the girl eventually stopped. "In your condition, you can't be wandering around here. Tell me where your unit is, and I'll turn the cart around and carry you home." As I motioned for the girl to turn around, I was interrupted. I was rendered absolutely helpless by what I witnessed when she did. The girl's white dress was entirely torn and stained with heavy red and brown stains, and her complexion had become mottled and an unattractive light gray tone. The girl's face was completely missing, leaving a dark cavernous emptiness in its stead, as if her entire face had been taken off of her skull. This is the worst part of what I witnessed, and it has stuck with me all these years later. After initially remaining still, she progressively began to cant her head, which was accompanied by the flexing of her neck muscles and a crackling sound. I ran back to the golf cart, threw it in reverse, and yelled loudly as I tried to do a K-turn, backing into a tree. I quickly finished the move and sped back down the pathway into the complex while still keeping the faceless girl in my peripheral vision. I wasn't even fazed by the impact. I felt completely out of control of my body as my heart was racing, my stomach was grumbling, and I was breathing quickly and frantically. I had no choice but to maintain a firm foot on the golf cart's accelerator and a fixed gaze on the road in front of me until I sprung out of the route back into the parking lot. I kept up my speed as I returned to the gatehouse and even disregarded a radio call from Bill, who yelled angrily at me for my speed after spotting me on one of the cameras. Upon my return, I was frantic and unable to speak. Really though, I didn't even sprint. I was significantly perspiring and required a few minutes to collect my breath. I was being frantically questioned by Bill and the other guard about what was wrong and what had happened to the golf cart's rear. Before I finally calmed down, all I could say was that I had seen something. When I had recovered, I explained what had happened to my two co-workers and flatly refused to go back to the North Trail. Bill even suggested that I might have been the victim of a nasty joke staged by one of the more mischievous younger residents, but I could tell they were suspicious and that I was truly rattled up. He promised to let me finish my duty in the gatehouse and let me depart early after having maintenance check the camera in the morning. The following week was spent absolutely avoiding the north route, and I even felt uneasy going anywhere by myself at night around the complex. The other guards were making fun of me because they assumed I had been the victim of a well-executed hoax, but I wouldn't talk about what I saw anymore. We received a report that an unleashed dog had entered the north path, which they weren't even supposed to walk down in the first place, about 10 days later, during one of my day shifts, so I had no choice but to look into it. Fortunately, Bill decided to come with me because he was working that day as well. I was shocked when we discovered the dog right where the girl had exited the golf cart that evening. A few feet into the undergrowth, between two oak trees, the German Shepherd had been feverishly barking, whining, and scratching at the ground. I recognized the other man as a resident of the complex and recalled that he was a recently retired police officer when he arrived on the scene. He eagerly approached us when we arrived, a look of profound concern on his face. "I'm sorry about the dog," he said in a hurry. He was a member of our K-9 team, and I just adopted him. The man's voice faltered as he turned to face the dog, which was still using its front paw to scratch at the ground and appeared to be focused on a single area. He used to be a cadaver dog, so I'll be honest with you, he always acted in this way when he thought he was getting a hit. Bill and I exchanged glances before returning to the man and glancing at him bewilderedly. As the speaker talked, my heart began to race. "I believe he smells a dead body. And I believe you should call the police to investigate," the speaker said. He reluctantly agreed to have us give the community's general manager a call. If this had occurred at the height of the tourist season, my opinion is that he wouldn't have, and he might have attempted to brush it off. The fact that the location in issue technically belonged to the Wildlife Management Area property meant that we had to first alert the Department of Fish and Wildlife, who maintained the site, meant that it took longer than expected for the police to arrive. In truth, the authorities did find skeletal remains when they dug the location. I was greatly concerned when I noticed that the skull the forensics team excavated was devoid of any face features while I was assisting with cordoning off the area while they worked. I later found out that the body belonged to a young woman who had been dead for around 30 years, long before the complex was even constructed. She must have passed at about the same time as a nearby 15-year-old girl went missing, whose case remained unsolved, I later read in the newspaper. I overheard one of the CSIs talking with the man whose dog discovered the burial on the day of the excavation, as the forensics team was removing the bones. I still get chills thinking about the man's response when the investigator inquired what the name of his dog was.